Hello everyone, and welcome to the third instalment of Behind the Paintings with Beth. Hi there everybody, thank you so much for joining me. It's lovely to have you tune in with me again. Thank you for all the feedback for the last two videos. I hope you're enjoying watching them and learning all about your favourite artists or potentially new favourite artists. Today we are going to be talking about no other than Lawrence Stephen Lowry. So, as discussed today, yes, we are going to be talking about no other than the one and only Lawrence Stephen Lowry, or L.S Lowry, or simply just Lowry, as he used to be like to be known as. Lowry was actually one of my granddad's very favourite artists, so this is dedicated to you, Granddad. So, let's start by introducing Lowry to you all with a little biography that I've put together for you. Lawrence Stephen Lowry is one of Britain's most famous and beloved industrial artists of the 20th century. Lowry was born on the 1st of November in 1887 in Lancashire. He was most commonly known for his Matchstick Men and for the urban landscape paintings that he produced, mainly based upon the working class of the northwest of England. A lot of these compiled of textile mills, factories, chimneys and red bricks a lot of the time to create that very urban and industrial look. Most of Lowry's work actually span all the way from the 1930s all the way up until the late 1960s. He actually said, in a quote, "I wanted to put the industrial scene on the map." Some critics may say that he was actually trying to paint the Industrial Revolution its very self. So here is an example of one of Lowry's most famous paintings that illustrates this concept ideally, entitled Coming to the Mill, which was painted in 1930. Lowry actually grew up in a place called Rusholme, which was a very middle class and very affluent area in Manchester. Lowry decided to leave school at the age of 16 and become an office clerk for an accounts firm. So in 1905, when Lowry was 18 years of age, he secured a place at the Manchester College of Art, where he studied under the French Impressionist Pierre-Adolphe Vallet. Then skip ahead 10 years, whilst he was working. In 1915, Lowry went to study at the Salford School of Art, or the Royal Technical College, as some may say, or which is better known as, in today's terms, Salford University. This is where it is believed he actually established his very own style as an artist. However, when Lowry was 21, he moved to Pendlebury, near Bolton, with his family, as they had fallen on extremely hard times. Lowry's profession at the time was actually following in the footsteps of his father as a rent collector working for an estate agent, as well as his father having an influence upon Lowry's decision to become a rent collector. Some may say that it was because of his love of people that he stayed in the profession so long. Also, Lowry loved meeting people, he loved studying them in a professional way, which some could say actually stirred his passion for people watching in general and fueled his interest in the characteristics of human beings. So, fun fact time, I was told recently by one of my friends that their great-great-grandfather used to own an office that Lowry actually used once upon a time. It wasn't for his paintings though. One of Lowry's lifelong friends, actually Carol Ann Lowry, who isn't blood related, she actually referred to him as Uncle Lowry. They were that close. Lowry actually left all of his estate to her as well because she was such a big fan of his. But Carol Ann used to actually refer to Lowry as being the king of people watching. Now let's go back to Pendlebury, where Lowry found himself living with his mother and father all of a sudden, where his life seemed to have almost taken a turn. It took him a long time to adjust to living there, as he actually goes on to say. At first I disliked it intensely, then after a year or two I got used to it. Then Lowry became interested by it, then eventually obsessed by it, and then he says, and practically I did nothing else for 25 to 30 years. Unfortunately, in 1932, Lowry's father passed away unexpectedly, which was a huge turning point for Lowry and his mother. Elizabeth Lowry, his mother, fell into a deep depression, upon which her health then eventually deteriorated and she retired to bed. So Lowry's relationship with his mother was very complicated in the sense that whilst he was her full-time carer, he was also working full-time as a rent collector. But unfortunately, his mother would be incredibly harsh on Lowry and give him a very hard time, especially when it came to his paintings. Some may well say this is because she felt her late husband had failed them both, because they'd ended up moving from a very affluent area in the region to then a very depressive, poor area. She did genuinely despise the fact that they had lost their wealth and they had to move to Pendlebury. All Lowry had ever wanted was his mother's approval, especially when it came to his paintings. She was never really a big fan, and she always made him feel like he was wasting his time. However, the only painting that Mrs. Lowry is said to have ever liked was called Sailing Boats, which was painted by Lowry in 1930, which he'd actually painted especially for her. So with this positive response to this one and only painting that she ever grew accustomed to, Lowry held on to that positive thought and continued to paint despite knowing how his mother really felt. Because at the end of the day, painting to Lowry, it was his lifeline. It was an escape from his reality, a place where he could go and just be himself and relax. However, in 1939, when his mother passed away, Lowry, understandably, was utterly grief-stricken, and as a result, the house on Station Road where they'd lived for so many years ended up actually being repossessed by the landlord because he'd neglected it so much. So Lowry found himself moving again to Cheshire, to a little village called Mottram, which is where Lowry lived out the rest of his days as a painter. So just to give you guys a little bit of an idea of the paintings we're going to be discussing today, I've just created a little breakdown here on the side where you can see. There are many paintings in this list that I will be discussing as we go along as well, so there's a few just to give you an idea about some of the work that we will be looking into. I've managed to choose the ones though that I like the most from my research, and I really hope that you guys can connect to them just as much as I can as well. So let's start with the message and the meaning behind Lowry's paintings and why he painted them, why he did. There is just so much to say here regarding why he painted what he painted and the reason he painted it. And of course, there's nobody better than the man himself to actually describe that. So I've managed to hunt down some quotes of Lowry's upon which he actually said himself that I'm looking forward to sharing with you all as we go along. So by the 1950s, Lowry began to paint some of his most memorable work. So let's backtrack just a little bit though, just so we can touch on some of his earlier work. They'd often be described as having a character of emptiness about them. And we know Lowry painted from his imagination of everyday life, scenes of the hustle and bustle of the working class. You can actually see it for yourself here in his piece entitled Going to Work, painted in 1943. Some may say he was trying to capture the loneliness on people's faces, and even though they are in the midst of a crowd surrounded by people full of life, full of stories and full of love to give, perhaps the message he was trying to convey in this particular painting was that he was trying to emphasize how people really feel deep down. He just wanted to represent the true emotions of the people of his time and generation. Lowry actually says himself, he quotes, "The world is full of very odd creatures. They're about if you observe them." But the interesting thing is that he goes on to say, what happened to them and how did they get into that state? And to Lowry, it doesn't really matter what essentially was in the background, even though the mills and the chimneys were very important in terms of his signature style. He actually says, I just want the man or woman, I just want the subject to paint. As all Lowry really was interested in was the people, he wanted to illustrate the oppression and the hardship that they were enduring. A lot of the time, Lowry would actually refer to his figures as ghosts or lonely souls. He also interestingly goes on to say, no one is free. We're all captured in a picture. Everyone is a stranger to everyone else. The exhaustion and the emptiness you can actually see on their facial expressions. Some say were a representation or a personal reflection upon how Lowry was actually feeling himself. Lowry actually lived a very solitary life. He had no relatives, he never married, he never even went abroad or even owned a car. The sad truth is that some may say Lowry actually felt very crippled by life, which then led him to perceiving himself as unworthy as a result, which is a shame because he was so worthy. This is actually evident in a painting he created in 1949 entitled The Cripples. And here you can see the look of devastation on some of the faces that he created. Some of them probably were of people he'd seen in the street walking down the road, that Lowry may have deliberately recorded in his mind in order to express that on a canvas. His friend Carol Ann, in her memoirs of Lowry, she mentions that Lowry said, "I have no family, only my studio. If it weren't for painting, I couldn't live. It helps me forget that I am alone." It's actually quite sad, but it's also very comforting to know that his painting ultimately preserved his life. This quote ultimately transitions nicely into the next painting we're going to be looking at, which is entitled Man Lying on a Wall, which was painted in 1957. Perhaps the man lying on this wall in this very painting is a depiction of Lowry himself, staring up at the sky in pure bewilderment of what life really means. Lowry was a very deep thinker, and he expressed that through his art. It's strange to think that Lowry said he never really knew where his ideas came from. He actually says, "I don't really know where my inspiration comes from. I just sit down and start painting without knowing what I'm going to do." But it's evident in his subconscious somewhere that his whole life, the people around him and his experiences, and the industrial surroundings he endeavoured upon, which were key indicators in what was being narrated, surely. This is prominent in his painting entitled The Rush Hour, painted in 1964, where he'd paint from memory, creating a bustling scene full of people with all sorts of characteristics. He was also very well known for the black dogs that he painted within the crowd scenes. Maybe he painted them to accompany the lonely souls walking within that crowd, so perhaps they weren't so alone after all. He actually quotes, "I do feel the pictures I like the best are from my imagination. That's more me. I paint people as I see them, from my mind's eye." So it's safe to say that ultimately Lowry, within this painting and all of his other inspired paintings, truly did come from his daily life, just simply walking the streets, meeting people, getting to know the quirks of society, and he must have met a lot of oddballs, but I believe that's why he decided to paint them, because he was celebrating humanity. In order to get into the zone as well, to help him become inspired, so to say, he'd also listen to classical composers such as the likes of Bellini to help him set the mood, switch off, wind down, or as he would say, take him to the other side. It's actually worth mentioning that Lowry was a huge fan of the Italian pre-Raphaelite painter Dante Gabriele Rossetti. He used to hang a lot of Rossetti's portraits up in his house. He especially admired the portraits of Janie Morris, upon who Rossetti used to paint frequently. So Lowry actually goes on to paint a portrait of a mysterious woman called Anne in a similar style to Rossetti. It is entitled Portrait of Anne, painted in 1957. Some say Anne may well have been the daughter of family friends who had passed away. For Lowry, indeed, this portrait was completely unexpected, but I think it's rather beautiful because he's trying to capture innocence and purity, and that's something that, even though Lowry was well known for capturing expressions on people's faces, this portrait of Anne creates a reflection of calm, order, sophistication, and almost a very regal feel, like a Rossetti painting. So we've touched on why we think Lowry painted what he painted and why, and the message and meaning behind his paintings. There's so much more to talk about, but obviously there's only so much time for these videos, so we know so far that Lowry loved capturing a moment in time, and he just wanted to represent them and be a voice for them. It was almost as if he was trying to take a screenshot of the way society was for that generation. And it's nice to know that many people today can actually still relate to the people in his paintings. So with these people in mind that Lowry was portraying, that leads us nicely onto the next section of our discussion, which is composition and colour. As we've already said, the people are painted from his memory. He actually says, you can't photograph these things. I suppose even if Lowry did own a camera, he would never have taken a photograph of them anyway. I think he just preferred to just remember them as they were in that moment in time. We touched on earlier when we mentioned that he was known as the Matchstick Man. Ultimately, a lot of the figures he painted resembled childlike stickmen. However, he was also regularly accused of his figures resembling the likes of a puppet. it. He may well have been hyperbolizing some of it to a degree, but that's okay because I think he just wanted to put down on paper how he felt. And I think by using images that looked almost matchstick-like in his compositions did create that sense of anonymity about these people, which gave them that privacy back. So he wasn't exclusively outing anybody for their identity. He ultimately protected them by creating these almost caricatures or puppet-like figures. As touched on earlier, the composition, as you can clearly see in a lot of his paintings, construct of mills, factories, chimneys, which all effectively especially caught his eye, which are ultimately the backdrop for most of his paintings. This is what you get when you look at a Lowry painting, a very urban landscape, industrial, smoky, dirty, and you get a very concrete, eerie feeling almost looking at them because there's no plants, there's no trees, there's no greenery anywhere. So these are all of the key elements in some of Lowry's paintings, as well as the figures he painted. As you can see also in this painting entitled Industrial Landscape, painted in 1955, these objects would tend to be the key factors he would paint first to create the overall structure and the overall composition. This is where Lowry really thought about negative space. In terms of negative space, which we've briefly touched on in other videos, negative space is obviously the areas out around the object. It's outside the object. It's the space that isn't filled. It's the space in the painting that isn't occupied, that creates breathing room, that ultimately helps the composition all pull together in a way that wouldn't have done had it all just been crowded onto one piece of paper without any thought. I believe Lowry was incredibly spatially aware when it came to planning his drawings, even though I know he said he just sat down and started painting. As he was so clever, he would just do it as he went along. But that takes real skill to know where to place certain objects, where to place the factory with the chimney, where to place that brick wall or that row of houses on that housing estate that ultimately broke up the scene of the painting. So in this painting, Industrial Landscape, as you can clearly see, there's very few people painted in this. He doesn't have his Matchstick Men there. It's very much a landscape painting, one that you wouldn't expect to be a landscape painting because of the buildings and the industrialization captured within it. However, interestingly enough, skip ahead 10 years, in his painting Industrial Scene, painted in 1965, here Lowry actually captures the best of both worlds. What with the red brick houses in the foreground and the people busily rushing around in the middle of the picture. Then you've got the smoky chimneys dominating the polluted sky. And then in the far distance, which is actually quite unexpected, you've got the rolling hazy hills of Lancashire. This shows, as well as Lowry being able to create an eclectic painting, it shows he also had a true eye for perspective when it came to depth in his paintings. He actually says, "It all takes balancing, which isn't easy to do," which is again evident in his work, as he was incredibly detailed in terms of the content he wanted to create and the mood he was trying to set. Some of Lowry's paintings actually took up to 2 years to paint, purely because he put so much thought into them. Even though he would say he wasn't really thinking about it, but subconsciously there was a lot going on. He goes on to say, if you can balance the picture and be satisfied with it in your mind, and the same with perspective, use it as far as you need it. But then he says, but there's no reason for it to be exact. After all, it's all make-believe. It's not reality, so there's no problem with it. I like the fact that Lowry wasn't a perfectionist. You can actually tell just from what he said there that it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be exactly what you see right in front of you. You can create your own interpretation of how you view your life. Through his compositions, he was setting his own scene and creating his own Pendlebury in his own mind. So let's move on to the colour. So in terms of colour, Lowry's palette was limited to just 5 colours. Ivory black, scarlet vermilion, Prussian blue, yellow ochre, with a background of flake white, either on oil on wood or oil on canvas. As you can see from coming from the mill, the 1930s piece that he painted, this is a great example of how the colours are depicted in this painting. He used a lot of pale colours as well. His colours were never very vibrant, they were always pretty flat. They were almost very primary-like. He did used to mix them together. He also used tones of very dark greys and browns and blacks to represent the dirtiness and the pollution of the city, which is evident really in Coming to the Mill, as again it's very industrial. It represents the concrete society upon which he lived. There has actually been a dispute in regards to the flake white he used to use as the base of his canvases. Some may say that he used to use zinc white as well, which is a slightly brighter white for his backgrounds. And another fun fact is that he actually used the brand Winsor & Newton, which a lot of us watching this may well know of and still use and love to this day. If anything, when I think of a Lowry painting, I think of greys, creams, brick reds. I think of very mundane, dusty, depressive colours. He very rarely paints with green, not because he was depressing in any way. I think that that's what he was trying to represent, was that unfortunately the society he was living in was very depressed. And I think that those colours really do identify and capture that mood as well. I think Lowry did a wonderful job in depicting that in his characters. Even as I mentioned earlier, some of the colours in the rolling hills of the Lancashire background in the industrial scene painting from 1965, that even wasn't a green. All of his colours are extremely washed out and very pale, and that was deliberate. He didn't want to create a vivid, joyful picture. He wanted to create the reality that some people live in every day. You could even say that the colours he used create his overall look and the style that we're used to seeing. So whenever we see those colours, we would automatically think of Lowry. I really like the way he uses different pinches of colour to create his figures as well. Even if it's just a tiny stab of the paintbrush, it creates a hand or a hat. He uses them to create buggies or, you know, even the little dogs I mentioned earlier. And it's just really quirky, and I love that because human beings ultimately are wacky. I loved how he was trying to convey that message that every single person is an individual. Everybody has their own story to tell, even if they are in the midst of a crowd. They're unique and they are accounted for. It's also worth pointing out that in 1943, Lowry became a war artist. And also, as well as that, 8 years later in 1952, he was appointed as being the official artist at the time of the Queen's coronation. And then as a result of that, in 1955, he became an associate member of the Royal Academy of Arts. Lowry was also at the very height of his fame in 1957. And then by 1962, at the age of 75, he became a full member. When Lowry passed away on the 23rd of February in 1976 of pneumonia at the age of 88, a retrospective exhibition was held at the Royal Academy of Arts in his honour. They welcomed over 150,000 visitors alone, and they were waiting to enter in order to celebrate his memory. He was also offered an OBE and a knighthood in 1968 and twice over again, which Lowry actually ended up turning down all three offers. The sad truth is that he turned them down merely because he said his mother was no longer around to see how well he'd done, therefore there was simply no point. Nonetheless though, in October of the year 2000, in Salford Quays, the Lowry Centre opened in order to honour Lowry's memory. The Lowry Centre actually holds over 400 of Lowry's most esteemed pieces of work, most of which are actually on a permanent exhibition there. I remember as a young teenager, I had the privilege of visiting the Lowry Centre on a number of occasions with my grandparents. I was so in awe of his paintings and the effort that he made in order to paint what he achieved. The Tate collection actually holds over 20 of his other works, but I'm afraid they hardly ever see the light of day, which is a real shame. The last known Tate Art Gallery exhibition held in Lowry's memory was actually back in 2013 at the Tate Britain, and it was on for 5 months. Overall, Lowry was an incredibly talented and skillful painter. Even though it's said that people did criticise his work for being too childlike and naive, Lowry at the end of the day was most certainly an underdog, and he rose above everybody's criticism. Lowry has definitely landed on top of his game. I would say that he is probably one of the most celebrated English artists that has ever been. I'm incredibly proud of him, of just how he persisted with his passion and he never gave up. His paintings now sell for millions, some of which the incredible late Cilla Black used to own. The fantastic Sir Ian McKellen is also known for being a Lowry enthusiast, as he used to grow up in the same area as him in Lancashire. He'd also produced a documentary on his favourite artist entitled Looking for Lowry. In January 2020 of this year, a long-lost painting of Lowry suddenly re-emerged, which had been sold back in the 1940s to a private collector. This is actually entitled The Mill, Pendlebury, dated 1943. And you'll never guess what, it was recently sold at auction for £2.6 million. Now that is what you call an A-list artist, if I don't say so myself. It just goes to show his paintings are definitely going up in value by the year. And also it just goes to show how very popular Lowry is now in this day and age. His paintings really are a celebration of human life in all its imperfections and all its quirks. I really like Lowry, as he just seems like a really down-to-earth, simple kind of guy who never really let life get the better of him. He had a true British spirit, and one thing I loved about him is that he said this: "You don't need brains to be a painter, just feelings." And as Lowry wasn't very academic, much like myself, I can relate to that. You don't need to be clever in order to paint. Anyone can be an artist, anyone can paint. As long as you have emotion and a heart for it, then that's all that counts. And painting what he saw and what he felt is exactly what Lowry did. Also, I loved his tenacity when people used to ask him, "So why do you paint?" And he would always answer with, "Well, why shouldn't I paint?" I really admire his northern spirit and his daringness to just be his pure self in whatever situation. One critic has actually said, the more one looks at Lowry's work is a sort of self-extended portraiture. He painted something for every one of us, and this was Lowry's skill. As I've said before, Lowry captured a whole generation and a society of people, which is such a precious gift and memory upon which Lowry has left us with. It's because of him we now know what it looked and potentially felt like to be a citizen living in Lancashire at that time. So thank you, Lowry, for such incredible, astonishing works of art. It's lovely to know your hard work has truly paid off and you are now a national treasure of ours. You really are starting to get the recognition you certainly do deserve. So there we have it, everybody. That is my talk on Lowry for today. That's all. Thank you ever so much for watching. Please do not forget to connect and let me know your thoughts, ideas, comments, etc. I'd love to discuss any of these points with you, and let's start a conversation and talk some art. Thank you once again for watching. I hope this video has been useful to you. I'll see you next time. Bye.